The year 1780 had not gone well for the United States. In early May, the British, under General Sir Henry Clinton, had captured Charleston, South Carolina, and the American Southern Army. Later that month, Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton destroyed the remainder of the Continental troops in South Carolina at the controversial Battle of Waxhaw. Only the irregular partisan forces in the eastern swamps and back country resisted British control of the state. General Clinton had departed for New York, leaving General Charles, Lord Cornwallis, with the task to eliminate the partisan resistance and bring the South under British control. The Continental Congress, however, had its own plans to hinder the British efforts to conquer the southern states. General Washington sent General Johann Baron de Kalb, a French officer who had come to America to assist in her fight for independence, south with a force of 1,400 troops. These men from the Delaware and Maryland line were some of the best Continental soldiers. June 22nd, de Kalb with his army arrived at Hillsborough, North Carolina, the red dot and the red circle. He had few provisions at the time. A few days later, he reached Buffalo Ford on the Deep River, about 30 miles south of modern-day Greensboro, North Carolina. The red dot, but was forced to wait for militia reinforcements which did not arrive, and additional supplies which there were few of. After General Lincoln's capture at Charleston, de Kalb was technically the commander of the Continental Army in the South. Congress, however, did not want a foreign officer in such an important position. General Washington wished to place General Nathanael Greene as the commander of the Southern Army. Congress, however, selected Major General Horatio Gates, the so-called hero of Saratoga. Gates, a former British officer, had many influential friends in Congress, and he, along with some members of Congress, considered himself a superior commander to Washington. Gates assumed command on July 25th. The overconfident general titled these Continental troops in the South as the Grand Army and began planning an immediate attack on British forces in South Carolina. His target was the advanced British supply base at Camden, South Carolina. Camden was a good choice. It housed a large quantity of supplies and was garrisoned, so Gates believed, by less than 1,000 provincial British troops under Lord Rawdon. The British provincial units were comprised of loyalists, mostly from the former northern colonies, who had joined the British Army early in the war in support of the king. On the 27th, Gates began his march, marked in green, by the most direct, but not maybe the best route. De Kalb and other officers suggested the road by Salisbury to Charlotte and then to Camden. See the blue lines. The land along this route was rich in food and supplies. The inhabitants were patriots, able and willing to supply the soldiers. The army was currently exhausted and malnourished from its long march south with limited rations. If retreat from Camden was necessary, the road would be back to Charlotte and friendly country. On the other hand, the route Gates proposed, see the green line, while 50 miles shorter, ran through thinly populated, infertile pine barrens. It was a wilderness of deep sand, swamps, and multiple rivers that could become flooded in a matter of hours. The British had previously foraged what food and supplies could be obtained. The region was also populated by staunch loyalists. See the Battle of Morris Creek Bridge. Officers who knew the region and the condition of the army were surprised at Gates' proposal. They all agreed it was foolhardy and cruel to expect an army which had spent weeks traveling hundreds of miles on little or no food and was now at half rations to march a hard and difficult route and then do battle with a well-fed and well-rested enemy. The officers drafted a letter pointing out the advantages of the longer route, including the opportunity to pick up additional militiamen. Gates promised to call a council of officers to discuss the matter, but never did. The army marched on July 27th towards a barren and inhospitable land with little food and no promise of obtaining more along the way. Each day, the situation grew worse. Food, what little there was, ran out. The men ate green corn and peaches with the usual effects of diarrhea and dysentery. Inhabitants fled, taking all of their food and livestock. On August 7th, Gates was joined by 2,100 North Carolina militiamen of General Richard Caswell. 7 days later, at Rugsby's Mill, General Edward Stevens and 700 Virginia militia joined the army. Here he waited for 2 days, trying to decide his next move. During this time, he detached 2 cannon, 300 North Carolina militia, and 100 Maryland Continentals to Thomas Sumter so he could capture a British supply train. Cornwallis, learning that the American force was moving towards Camden, hastened from Charleston to join Rawdon. The British had a total force of 2,239 men. Many, however, were sick. Figures vary, but Cornwallis could only muster about 2,100 effective troops, but most were professional soldiers. Among this force was Tarleton's British Legion of 289 dragoons, which would prove devastating to the Continentals at the conclusion of the battle. On the American side, Gates had a total of between 3,000 to 4,000 men, though he believed the number to be between 5,000 to 7,000. Only 900 of his men, however, were disciplined troops, the Maryland and Delaware Continentals under DeKalb. With Cornwallis and Rawdon's forces fortified at Camden, Gates decided to march his army to Sanders Creek, 7 miles north of the town. The army set out at 10 p.m. on August the 15th. Gates's officers were incredulous. Colonel Ortho Williams later wrote how it could be conceived that an army consisting of more than 2/3 militia, and which had never been once exercised in arms together, could form columns and perform other maneuvers in the night and in the face of the enemy. Tired, sick, and worn out, soldiers set off on a long night march, expecting to engage the enemy in battle the next morning.
Moving along the approximate route of Gates's army towards the...
For more than 4 hours, the men trudged through the dark. Then suddenly, the night erupted in a clash of musketry. Cornwallis, by coincidence, had intended on surprising Gates with a night march. The two forces met in a moonlit night. Tarleton's advance guard had opened fire, which was returned by the surprised Americans. The British then charged, and the American infantry pulled back, but stood their ground, and their heavy firing halted Tarleton's advance. Both the British and the American armies deployed in line across the road, and firing stopped.
Here at the site of the Battle of Camden,
Gates was surprised to learn that the British were a mere 600 yards to his front. He called a council of war, but he had already made up his mind. They would remain where they were and fight. Gates gave the order, "To your command, gentlemen." It would be one of the few commands he would give during the battle. The battlefield today looks much like it did in 1780, a sparse, open wooded pine forest with swamps on both sides. The great wagon road ran through the middle of the battlefield, and each army deployed on either side of the road. This is a Google Earth view of the battlefield today. I'm not particularly good at graphics. The highway did not exist in 1780. The white line in the center is the Great Wagon Road. The Americans formed their battle line prior to sunrise. Typically, the British place the most experienced units on the right. Gates followed the procedure. The Continental troops were positioned on the right. Caswell's North Carolina militia was in the center, and Stevens' Virginians were on the left, with Colonel Charles Armand's Legion to its left flank. The 1st Maryland Regiment was held in reserve. Cannons were placed in the front of the Continental position, with a couple held in reserve. Baron de Kalb was in command of the right wing and took his place with the Continental line. Gates positioned himself 600 yards behind the American line. General Cornwallis organized his troops into 2 wings. To the opposite of the Continentals, the British left, were the Volunteers of Ireland, the British Legion Infantry, the Royal North Carolina Regiment, and Colonel Bryan's North Carolina Tory Volunteers. This force was under the command of Lord Rawdon. The British right was made up of the 33rd Regiment, Cornwallis's own, the 23rd Fusiliers, and a company of light infantry, all commanded by Lieutenant Colonel James Webber. The 71st Highlanders and 2 6-pound cannons and the British Legion cavalry formed the reserve. The irony of the troop placement is that the best trained and most professional of the British troops on the field faced the least trained and reliable of the American troops. At dawn, the American artillery fired on the advancing British as they deployed. Colonel Williams rode to Gates and reported the British advance and recommended Stevens' Virginians attack before the British could properly form up. Gates answered, "Sir, that is right. Let it be done." Gates also ordered DeKalb to advance the Continentals. These were the last orders he was to give that day. Williams rode to Stevens with the order, and the Virginians hesitated and then marched in a ragged, cautious advance. Cornwallis saw Stevens' cautious advance and ordered Webster to take advantage of the Virginians' timidity and charge. The British came on with a cheer, "Hurrah!" and came on quickly in close ranks as one killing machine. They fired one volley and charged with the feared bayonet. The Virginians were green, untrained militia, and the horror of seeing a row of glistening steel thrust forward by screaming, disciplined men was too much. A few militiamen managed to get off some harmless shots, but most dropped their guns and ran. One militiaman recalled, "It was instantaneous. There was no effort to rally, no encouragement to fight. Officers and men joined in the flight. I threw away my gun and ran." Stevens tried to rally the Virginians, but to no avail. North Carolina militiamen in the center were gripped with panic as they saw the Virginians flee. Without firing a single shot, the entire militia line of nearly 2,000 men tossed aside their muskets and fled for the rear and the swamps. With the fleeing militiamen was General Gates. He mounted his horse and did not stop riding until he was 200 miles north of the battlefield. One regiment of militia posted next to the Continentals held their ground. The American center and left was gone. The early morning mist and the thick clouds of smoke fogged the field. General DeKalb was unaware that his line was in serious danger of being flanked. He was busy driving back Rawdon's attack. Maryland Brigade, held in reserve, attempted to line up with DeKalb's men. The British, however,
Here at this position that the Maryland Brigade stood,
had moved on the Continentals' left and forced a gap between the two American wings. Cornwallis ordered the 33rd into the gap along with his entire reserve. Carleton's cavalry crashed through the Continentals, wielding right and left into their flanks and rear, followed by the 71st Highlanders. The American army was broken. Captain Kirkwood of the Delaware Line formed an organized retreat. Another 100 Continentals retreated in good order through the swamp where cavalry could not follow. The remainder of the army, who had not been killed, seriously wounded, or captured, fled into the swamps. General DeKalb had fallen, yet was still alive. This marker on the battlefield commemorates Baron DeKalb. This is not where he fell, was probably somewhere on the other side of the highway. He was propped up against a tree, bleeding to death, with 3 bullet wounds and 8 bayonet wounds, a testimony to his valor and courage. General Cornwallis rode by, and seeing the general stated, "I am sorry, sir, to see you. Not sorry that you are vanquished, but sorry to see you so badly wounded." It is reported DeKalb responded, "I thank you, sir, for your generous sympathy, but I die the death I have always prayed for, the death of a soldier fighting for the rights of man." He was taken to a residence in Camden and cared for by British surgeons. 3 days later, he died. On visiting DeKalb's grave several years later, George Washington is reported to have said, "So here lies the brave DeKalb, the generous stranger who came from a distant land to fight our battles and water with his blood the tree of liberty. Would to God he had lived to share its fruits." Tarleton's legion continued to chase after the fleeing Americans. For more than 20 miles, they cut down or captured men. The American Army's entire baggage, camp equipment, ammunition, and stores fell to the British. The fleeing remnants of the Grand Army retreated to Charlotte and then to Salisbury, eventually joining their commander, Horatio Gates, at Hillsborough, North Carolina. There's no accurate account of the American casualties. Historians and contemporaries all give different figures. A general estimate based on my research is that about 650 Continentals, nearly the entire strength of the experienced regular troops, were killed, wounded, or captured, and another 300 militiamen were also fatalities. There were around 1,000 men captured. The American Army is an army annihilated. British losses amounted to 324 men, 68 killed, 245 wounded, and 11 missing. What of Gates, the hero of Saratoga? His reputation would never recover. At the end of the day, he arrived at Charlotte, 60 miles from the battlefield, but did not stop. He continued on, arriving in 3 days at Hillsborough, North Carolina, 200 miles from Camden. For the next couple of months, he would reorganize the remnants of his Grand Army while Congress debated his replacement. Because of his friends in Congress, Gates would never be court-martialed or removed from the Army for his debacle at Camden, but Washington made sure he never commanded troops again. For the second time within 3 months, the American army in the South had been swept out of existence. Camden was probably the most disastrous battlefield defeat ever inflicted on the Continental Army, and what was left was in deplorable condition. At Hillsborough, there was less than 700 men out of almost 4,000 that originally marched to Camden, and few of these men were trained, disciplined Continentals. British, once again, the Southern strategy appeared to be successful. Georgia was totally within their control. Except for partisan activity, South Carolina was also in the British sphere. North Carolina would be next, and then Virginia. For the struggling United States, the situation was dire. A new commander had to be chosen, an army formed and equipped. But Congress did not despair. As usual, when disaster came, they turned to Washington and now called upon him to select a commander for the Southern Army.